Where is justice when the powerful rewrite the truth? When a grieving widow is told to stay silent, and a veteran with nothing left to lose decides he won't? One video, one voice, and suddenly a nation begins to listen. But when the truth threatens a man who owns the law itself, how far will they go to silence it again? This isn't just a story about guilt or innocence. It's about the moment ordinary people choose courage over fear. Would you have the strength to stand against the untouchable? Subscribe now and discover what happens when justice finally knocks on the wrong door. The rain came down in thin, whispering threads that seemed almost afraid to touch the quiet town of Ashford. Morning light struggled through a shroud of gray clouds, painting the narrow streets in tones of silver and sorrow. James Rowan pulled his coat tighter as he crossed the empty square, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet cobblestone. Beside him, Ranger, his aging German shepherd, moved with that dignified calm only old soldiers seemed to carry. The dog's fur was damp, his breath a soft mist in the cold air. Together, man and dog approached the small wooden church at the corner of the street, a place where the years hung heavy and every sound seemed to echo longer than it should. Inside, the air smelled of rain-soaked wood and candle wax. A handful of candles flickered near the altar, their fragile flames bending beneath the drafts that slipped through the cracks in the stained glass windows. James removed his cap, the motion slow and deliberate, almost reverent. For years, this church had been his refuge when memories grew too loud, the faces of men lost in the desert, the sound of gunfire swallowed by wind. He didn't come to pray. Prayer, he believed, was something for the innocent. He came to remember, to listen, and sometimes just to exist in a space where silence had meaning. Ranger padded quietly down the aisle and lay near the front pew, his head resting between his paws. The dog's amber eyes followed James with wordless loyalty. James knelt briefly, touching his fingers to the pew's worn surface as though tracing the ghosts carved into its grain. That was when he heard it. A soft sound that didn't belong to the rain or the wind. It was the sound of someone crying. He turned his head. Near the front, at the base of a marble cross, a woman knelt. She was young, maybe 30 at most, wrapped in a pale gray coat that looked far too thin for the weather. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her hands trembled as she clutched something small and silver between them. The sound of her sobs was raw, unguarded, and painfully human. James hesitated. He had learned to give grief its space, to let it breathe on its own. But there was something in the way she trembled, a loneliness he recognized too well, the kind that made a person forget how to stand. He approached slowly, his boots quiet on the stone floor. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice a low rumble softened by years of restraint. "Are you all right?" The woman flinched, as if pulled from some faraway place. She looked up. Her eyes were swollen, the edges rimmed with red, but behind the exhaustion there was something fierce, like a flame that refused to go out. "I'm fine," she whispered automatically, the lie falling apart before it even left her lips. James noticed the object in her hands, a wedding ring, simple and gold, its inner band engraved with 2 initials, E and E. He recognized the kind of love that etched itself into metal because it feared, forgetting. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his distance. "Didn't mean to intrude." She shook her head slowly, pressing the ring to her chest as though trying to hold something that had already slipped away. "It's just, today marks 6 months," she murmured. 6 months since they said my husband died because he was drunk behind the wheel. But he wasn't. He never drank, not even once. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't. Her voice cracked. It was a cover-up. James stood still, the words hanging heavy between them. He had heard that tone before, the quiet conviction of someone who had lost everything except the truth. "What was his name?" he asked softly. "Ethan," she said. "Ethan Carter." She drew a trembling breath, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. He was coming home from work that night. There was another car, one owned by Richard Hale. The police said Ethan lost control, but they sealed the report in 2 days, and the case was closed. She looked up at James then, searching his face not for pity, but for belief. You know what it's like when people stop listening? When they tell you to move on, to let it go. But how do you move on when every part of you knows it's wrong? James's throat tightened. He thought of the letters he'd never answered, the folded flag that still sat untouched in a drawer. He knew too well the sound of injustice, how it crept in when the world looked away. Ranger lifted his head then, letting out a low, soft whine, as if echoing her pain. James crouched beside the dog, his gaze still locked on Evelyn. I know what it's like, he said quietly, to lose someone and be told that's just how it is. She studied him, perhaps recognizing the same hollowness in his expression that lived in hers. You're a soldier, she said finally. Was, he corrected. Now I just fix fences and try not to think too much. He managed a faint, humorless smile. Doesn't work most days. Evelyn looked back at the cross, her fingers tracing the ring again. I keep praying, she whispered. Not for a miracle, just for someone to believe me. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the hills. The sound seemed to vibrate through the church, rattling the glass like a warning. James looked toward the doorway, then back to her. Maybe what you need isn't a miracle, he said. Maybe you just need someone who's tired of watching the wrong people win. The woman blinked, startled, and for the first time that morning, the corner of her mouth trembled toward something almost like hope. Ranger rose to his feet, moving closer, resting his head gently against Evelyn's knee. She reached down, hesitant at first, then buried her fingers in his damp fur. A quiet warmth passed between them, simple and unspoken. Outside, the rain began to ease, and a thin ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds, falling across the marble floor, in a soft golden stripe that landed between the three of them, man, woman, and dog. For the first time in a long time, James Rowan didn't feel alone. Somewhere deep in his chest, a long silent instinct stirred, the one that had once driven him to fight, to protect, to seek the truth. And as he watched the woman whisper another silent prayer, he knew this wasn't chance. It was a beginning. By the time the rain had stopped, the air outside the church carried the faint smell of wet pine and the slow thaw of morning. James and Evelyn walked side by side down the narrow gravel path, the sound of their steps quiet but steady. Ranger followed a few paces behind, his fur still damp, his nose low to the ground as if tracing invisible trails left by ghosts. James didn't say much, he rarely did, but his mind was already a map of questions, and every road on that map pointed toward the same place, the truth behind a man's death. When they reached the end of the path, Evelyn paused beside an old oak tree. I still have his things, she said softly. In the attic. They gave me a box when the investigation closed. His clothes, his wallet, some papers. She hesitated, eyes downcast. Sometimes I open it just to feel close to him again. James studied her for a moment, then nodded. Show me. Her house sat on the edge of town, small and modest, with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked with the wind. Inside, everything was neat, almost too neat, as if order was the only way to keep the pain from spilling over. Photos lined the mantel. Ethan in his mechanic's uniform, smiling beside Evelyn under the summer sun, and one picture of them both holding a half-built go-kart, laughter frozen mid-breath. James felt the quiet ache of envy, the kind that belonged to someone who'd once had something precious and lost it before realizing how much it meant. Evelyn disappeared up the stairs and returned with a weathered cardboard box. She set it on the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of a life abruptly halted, a leather wallet, scuffed but still carrying the smell of motor oil, a folded work ID card from Hale Industries, where Ethan had once been a safety technician, and an old gray jacket that looked ordinary until Ranger stepped closer, sniffed once, and froze. The dog's ears perked up, his body tensing in that old, trained way James hadn't seen in years. James crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Ranger sniffed again, low and deliberate, then looked up with a short whine. James took the jacket carefully, brought it to his nose, and closed his eyes. It wasn't the sour burn of alcohol that hit him, but something sharper, chemical, metallic. "Ethanol," he murmured, "and industrial lubricant, not whiskey." Evelyn frowned. "You mean—" "I mean he wasn't drunk," James said, voice low, controlled. "Whatever was on this jacket, it's not from a bar. It's from a workshop, maybe even from the crash site itself." He pulled out a notebook from his coat pocket, the kind he hadn't used since his deployment, and began jotting quick notes. Evelyn watched him, her confusion giving way to something fragile but alive, hope. "But the police tested for alcohol. They said his blood level was over the limit." James looked up. "Blood samples can be replaced. Reports can be rewritten, especially if someone like Richard Hale wanted them that way." The name hung heavy in the room. Evelyn swallowed hard. "You know him?" "Everyone who's spent time in Tennessee knows him," James replied. "Owns half the factories in 3 counties. Gives speeches about integrity and progress while buying silence with both hands." He flipped through the jacket's inner pocket and found a folded sheet of paper, stained and barely legible. It was a safety inspection checklist dated a week before the crash, signed by Ethan and countersigned by Richard Hale himself. "Your husband flagged a malfunction," James said, reading the note. "Something about brake fluid contamination in one of the company trucks." His eyes narrowed. "And that truck, the one involved in the crash, belonged to Hale Industries." The color drained from Evelyn's face. "He reported it," she whispered. "He said he would. He said he couldn't live with himself if he ignored it." She pressed a hand to her mouth as tears welled again, not of grief this time, but realization. "They covered it up, didn't they?" James didn't answer right away. He was staring at the document, tracing the faint pen marks beneath Ethan's signature, the kind of indentation left when someone writes on top of another sheet. He angled it toward the light, saw faint words bleeding through. "Get it done. Quietly. No paper trail." The handwriting wasn't Ethan's. It was bold, slanted, confident. The kind of script that belonged to a man who believed he'd never be questioned. "That's Hale's hand," Evelyn whispered, recognizing it from old invoices Ethan had brought home. James folded the note carefully and slipped it into a plastic sleeve. "This is our first thread," he said, "but we'll need more than paper to pull down a man like him." Ranger barked softly, breaking the stillness. He'd wandered toward the window, tail stiff, gaze fixed on a black sedan parked across the street. James followed his line of sight. 2 men sat inside, pretending to read newspapers in the rain that had just begun again. "You expecting company?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. The soldiers in James's bones woke up. He reached to the back of his belt where a small folding knife rested out of old habit. "They're watching the house," he murmured. "Hale must have heard you talk to someone." Evelyn's face went pale. "What do we do?" James moved to the curtain, peeking through the sliver of light. The sedan engine started, rolled down the street, and vanished into the mist. "For now, nothing," he said. "They just wanted you to see them, to remind you of your place." He turned back to her, his voice hardening. "But they made a mistake." "What mistake, Viv?" she asked. "They reminded me of mine." Ranger's tail brushed against Evelyn's leg as if to reassure her. James placed the jacket back in the box, his expression set with quiet resolve. Tomorrow, I'm going to Hale Industries. If there's a crack in his story, I'll find it. Evelyn looked at him, fear and trust warring in her eyes. Why are you helping me, Mr. Rowan? James paused, hand on the door. Because someone once helped me when no one else would, he said softly, and because a man's truth shouldn't die with him. Outside, the storm gathered again, but this time it felt different. Not like mourning, but like warning. The kind that precedes the first strike of thunder. Morning came with the brittle clarity of winter sunlight, the kind that exposes more than it warms. James stood outside the towering glass facade of Hale Industries, his reflection fractured across the mirrored surface like a man split between two lives, the soldier he once was and the man he had become. Ranger sat obediently beside him, tail still, eyes fixed on the revolving doors where men in suits moved like clockwork. Inside, banners stretched across the lobby announcing the day's event. Charity Gala for Road Safety Awareness, sponsored by Hale Industries. The irony wasn't lost on James. A company accused of hiding the truth about a deadly crash now preaching about safety. It was a performance polished for the cameras. He adjusted his collar and stepped through the doors, his old leather boots sounding too heavy against the marble floor. No one stopped him. He looked unremarkable, just another guest with a quiet purpose. The ballroom upstairs shimmered with excess. Crystal chandeliers threw shards of light across silver-draped tables, the air thick with perfume and polite laughter. Reporters moved like shadows among the guests, their smiles rehearsed, their notebooks empty until told otherwise. At the center of it all stood Richard Hale, a tall man in a tailored gray suit, his posture impeccable, his smile calculated to the millimeter. His hair was silver, his cufflinks gold, and his eyes, they were the color of polished steel, cold and merciless. When he raised his glass, the room hushed. To safety, Hale declared, voice deep and rich like aged whiskey. To responsibility, to progress, and to the men and women who make our roads safer every day. The applause that followed was thunderous and hollow. James watched from the edge of the crowd, his jaw tightening. The same hands that toasted to safety had signed a report condemning an innocent man. The same lips that promised accountability had whispered, "Get it done quietly." Ranger lay at his feet, silent but alert, the muscles beneath his coat tense. The dog's ears flicked once, sensing his master's rising heartbeat. James took a slow breath and reminded himself that revenge and justice were not the same thing. He needed proof, not anger. After the speeches, the crowd dissolved into smaller clusters of handshakes and wine glasses. James drifted toward the back hallway, away from the noise, his eyes scanning for cameras. He found a maintenance door half open and slipped through, emerging into a dim corridor lined with security monitors. The hum of machinery filled the space. An older man in a faded uniform sat slouched in a chair, eating from a paper cup of noodles. He looked up, startled when James entered. "You're not supposed to be here," the guard said, narrowing his eyes. James raised his hand slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to ask about a car accident, a night when something went wrong." He slid a folded photo across the table. It was of Ethan Carter smiling in his workshop, grease on his hands. The guard hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "You should leave," he muttered. "People don't like questions around here." James took a slow step closer. "You were on duty that night, weren't you?" The guard froze. James continued, voice steady but heavy with something that wasn't just suspicion. It was conviction. "I know you saw something, Mr. Lewis. You don't have to protect him anymore." For a long moment, the hum of the monitors was the only sound. Then Lewis sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from years of silence. "That night," he whispered, Mr. Hale's car came in around midnight. The front fender was scratched deep, looked like it had hit something solid. He told me to call the night mechanic, said it was urgent. They replaced the entire frame before morning. The report said the car never left the garage that night, but I saw it come in. I saw him step out, hands shaking. He looked up at James, eyes glassy with regret. The mechanic, he's gone now. Died 2 weeks later. Said it was a heart attack. Maybe it was. James felt a cold wave crawl up his spine. Every word fit into the puzzle he had started assembling. He slid a small recording device back into his pocket, its red light blinking faintly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's more than you know." As he turned to leave, Lewis grabbed his arm. "Be careful," the old man warned. "Hale doesn't lose. People who make him look bad don't get second chances." James nodded once. Neither do people who lie to widows. When he stepped back into the ballroom, the air felt suffocating. Cameras flashed as Richard Hale posed beside a large check, his arm around a senator's wife. Their laughter cut through the music like broken glass. James paused by the doorway, watching the man who had turned guilt into a brand. Ranger pressed close to his leg, sensing the tension in his stance. "Not yet," James whispered, patting the dog's head. "We'll bring him down the right way." Outside, the afternoon light was fading into amber. James walked to his truck parked across the street and sat behind the wheel for a long time, the city hum muffled behind the glass. He replayed the recording, hearing the guard's weary voice again. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was a start. Evelyn deserved more than whispers. She deserved a confession carved into stone. He glanced at Ranger, who rested his head on James's thigh, eyes loyal and steady. "We're in deep now, boy," James murmured, "but we're not backing out." The dog's tail thumped once against the seat, quiet but sure. As they drove away, James caught one last glimpse of Hale through the rearview mirror, standing beneath the golden lights, shaking hands, smiling that perfect smile. The image burned into him, a promise of what was coming. Power could silence a courtroom, but it couldn't silence truth forever. And James Rowan, once a soldier, now carried a new mission, one fought not with bullets, but with evidence, courage, and the weight of a vow. No man's death should ever be rewritten by money. Night fell heavy over Ashford, wrapping the town in the kind of silence that presses against your chest until you feel your own heartbeat louder than the wind. James parked his truck outside Ethan Carter's old garage, a squat brick building at the end of a forgotten road. The "For Rent" sign creaked on its chain, and dust clung to the windows like time refusing to let go. Ranger leapt out first, sniffing the damp ground, tail low, alert. James followed, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. The padlock gave way after a few stubborn seconds, and the door moaned as it opened. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of rust and motor oil, thick enough to taste. Tools still hung on the walls, untouched since the night Ethan never came back. A half-fixed engine sat on the workbench, a cigarette burned out in the ashtray beside it, its ashes long turned to gray ghosts. James walked slowly, scanning every inch of the room. He'd been here once before, briefly after the funeral, but back then he hadn't been looking for truth, just closure. Now he was looking for evidence, something the police hadn't bothered to see, or worse, something they had seen and buried. Ranger padded toward an old sedan parked under a tarp. The dog sniffed around its base, ears twitching. Then came the sound, a faint scratch, metal against metal. Ranger barked once, sharp and low. "Easy, boy," James murmured, lifting the tarp. The car beneath was Ethan's, its blue paint dulled by dust, windshield spidered with cracks. The front bumper bore a scar of impact that hadn't been mentioned in any report. James crouched, running his hand along the floor mat. Something clicked beneath his fingers. A loose panel. He pried it open, revealing a small metal casing wrapped in tape. Ranger let out a soft growl of satisfaction, as though confirming his find. Inside the casing was a black dash cam, its lens cracked but intact. The memory card slot was still occupied. James exhaled slowly. "You clever son of a gun," he whispered to Ethan's ghost. "You hid your witness." Hours later, in the dim glow of his kitchen, James sat across from his old friend Gary Nichols, a former military systems analyst turned reluctant tech freelancer. Gary's apartment smelled of coffee, cables, and insomnia. "You know this could get us both in trouble," Gary said, inserting the memory card into his laptop. "If this involves Hale, he's got half the police department on his payroll." James leaned back in his chair. "Then let's make sure the other half sees the truth." The screen flickered to life, showing corrupted files and lines of code. Gary's fingers flew across the keyboard, muttering to himself. Ranger lay on the floor, watching them like a silent sentry. "Someone tried to wipe it clean," Gary said, eyes narrowing. "But they didn't do a full overwrite. Typical corporate arrogance. They always assume no one will look twice." After several tense minutes, a distorted image appeared. A road, wet and glistening under the headlights. The timestamp matched the night of the crash. The footage trembled as the car sped down a narrow stretch of highway. Rain hammered against the windshield, wipers screeching in rhythm. A flash of light appeared ahead, another car swerving into view. Tires screeched, metal screamed, and then silence. The camera tilted sideways, capturing chaos in brief, violent bursts. Through the static, two voices emerged. One was panicked. "God damn it, Hale, we hit him. He's still moving, we have to go back." The other voice was colder, steady, unmistakably in control. "No, keep driving." Gary froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Tell me I didn't just hear that." James's stomach turned. "Play it again." The voices repeated, clearer this time. The second one, the one giving the order, matched perfectly with the man James had watched raise a glass at the gala. Richard Hale. James's pulse pounded in his ears. "Save it," he ordered. "Every frame, every timestamp." Gary copied the recovered file to multiple drives. "You've got enough here to burn him to the ground," Gary said quietly. "But you need to be careful. If he learns you have this—" He didn't finish the sentence. James stood, pulling on his coat. "He won't find out until it's too late." Ranger rose immediately as if he understood. The air outside was colder now, sharp enough to sting. As James stepped onto the porch, headlights flared at the end of the street. A black SUV idled there for a moment, then rolled away. Gary noticed too, his expression tightening. "You're being followed." James didn't look back. "Let them watch," he said. "Maybe it's time they realize they're not the only ones keeping records." He drove through the night toward Evelyn's house, the flash drive burning a metaphorical hole in his pocket. She opened the door in her robe, eyes wide with confusion and exhaustion. James placed the drive in her hand. "Ethan wasn't drunk," he said simply. "He was murdered, and I can prove it." Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the tiny piece of plastic like it was a relic of salvation. "What happens now?" she whispered. James looked past her to the dark horizon where the first hints of dawn were breaking. "Now," he said, voice steady as stone, "we bring him into the light." The morning court smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper, a sterile theater where fate was supposed to be decided by careful words and measured evidence. But today it felt like something else entirely. An elegant stage dressed to dismiss an inconvenient truth. James sat in the wooden pew with Evelyn beside him. Ranger curled at their feet like a small, patient sentinel, and the USB drive containing Ethan's voice burned hot in his pocket, as if it wanted to leap out and speak before anyone else could silence it. They had done everything by the book, handed the footage to the investigator, waited while the paperwork crawled through channels, and finally, with trembling hands and a hollow hope, filed it as part of the motion to reopen the investigation. What followed was a ritual of polite cruelty disguised as procedure. The prosecutor, a young woman with tired eyes who had once seemed sympathetic, read the lines she had been given with the detachment of someone who has learned to survive within rules that do not always serve justice. She argued that the evidence needed verification, that chain of custody was imperfect, that warrants were required to admit material recovered from private property, and each rational-sounding phrase slid like a blade into Evelyn's fragile faith. Across the room, the defense attorney for Hale moved like a dancer practiced in persuasion. Marcus Thorne, immaculate in his dark suit and practiced smile, unfolded a legal argument that smelled of motion books and corporate experience, speaking of precedents and suppression motions until the air was thick with the sense that language itself could be weaponized to hide a man behind formality. James watched Hale sitting to the side, hands folded as if in prayer, a senator's wife leaning closer to murmur approval. The cameras had been invited. The cameras had taken portraits of the accused philanthropist with the same smiles that painted over inconvenient truths, and now those smiles were shields. In less than 15 minutes, the judge, an austere woman whose years behind the bench had taught her to value procedure above persuasion, ruled the footage inadmissible on technical grounds. That single gavel knock hit James like a physical blow, a hammer smacking hope into splinters. Evelyn huddled into herself as the world narrowed to the sound of her sobs. Ranger rose, head low, a deep growl rumbling from his throat that sounded less like a canine noise and more like an animal's protest against the semblance of fairness. People shuffled, papers rustled, and outside the courtroom doors, the press whispered into their devices, waiting for a narrative they could package in neat headlines. Hale maintains innocence. Court upholds evidence rules. Case remains closed. James felt a cold rage settle in his gut, but he had learned in other theaters, those filled with sand and smoke, that fury without direction devours the very thing it promises to save. He closed his fists, until the knuckles whitened and looked at Evelyn, whose face was streaked with tears, but whose eyes were suddenly not empty. There was grief, yes, but there was also a tiny, defiant ember that had been kindled by their small victories and the breath of truth that had reached the light, if only for a fleeting moment. "They can lock it up in a courtroom," James said quietly, voice thick with contained force. "But courts are not the only place where truth can be heard." Evelyn blinked, looking at him as if weighing the cost of what he suggested, and then nodded as if the thought had been waiting behind her ribs all along. They left the courthouse into a bright, indifferent day. The sun cut through the city like an unasked question. Outside the plaza, people streamed past, many with their own small battles and quieter griefs. James felt the press of ordinary lives and the sudden, dangerous opportunity it presented. Institutions can close, judges can rule, but people can see, remember, and amplify. Back at Gary's cramped apartment, they sat for hours under the harsh glare of monitor light and mapped a different strategy. If the legal door would not open, they would pry open a different one. Public opinion, the modern courtroom of cameras, timelines, and viral outrage. Gary, who had always preferred code to confrontation, set up secure copies of the footage, encrypted backups, and a plan to authenticate the files in a way that would survive scrutiny outside black-robed chambers. Evelyn dictated a statement, her voice at first trembling, then gaining cadence as she told the truth, not as a pleading widow, but as a witness to a life stolen. James wrote down names, witnesses they could coax into speaking, documents to obtain through Freedom of Information requests, garage logs to subpoena, the mechanic's old notebook that might yet prove tampering. And when night spilled across the town, a small, determined group had formed. James, Evelyn, Gary, and Ranger, each playing a part in a different kind of proceedings. They began to seed the story, not recklessly but with a craftsman's care, contacting a local reporter known for bending the narrative toward accountability, sharing fragments of the footage alongside corroborating evidence, and asking only that the reporter look. The reporter, a woman with a reputation for stubbornness, listened and then did something more than listen. She dug. Within 2 days, her column ran, an investigative piece that framed the questions Hale had hoped to keep buried. Vehicle servicing records that contradicted the official line, a maintenance log that showed the truck Hale's company owned had an unexplained repair the night in question, and an anonymous testimony from a mechanic who admitted his hands had fixed what should never have been replaced. The article did not yet convict, but it redirected attention. People began to talk, to share, to demand answers. Social feeds lit up with outrage, shaped into queries, with hashtags that stitched strangers into a chorus demanding a reopening. The prosecutor, who had once read the motion aloud, felt the tug of a public now watching and asked the police to take a second look. Small cracks appeared in the edifice of immunity. That night, as James and Evelyn sat on the porch of her house with Ranger asleep at their feet, they allowed themselves a cautious relief, no victory yet, but a path forward. Proof that when the legal road dead ends, there are other paths that bend toward justice. And when enough ordinary people step onto those paths together, even the richest man in a gray suit may find his sanctuary exposed to light. The upload took less than a minute, but its echo would last far longer. James sat in front of the screen, the pale glow reflecting off his face while Evelyn's trembling hands hovered over the keyboard. Her letter appeared above the video, simple and devastating in its honesty. If you've ever lost someone because the rich were allowed to walk free, share our story. Help us bring the truth back to the light. She clicked post. The sound was nothing, just a small mechanical click. But in that instant, the silence of grief turned into something alive. They watched the counter climb. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. By nightfall, the number had grown beyond comprehension. Comments poured in, some angry, some broken, some filled with stories of their own losses. And somewhere between those words, a movement began to breathe. By the next morning, national headlines had found them. The widow, the veteran, and the billionaire. America's new fight for justice. Evelyn's picture appeared beside James's on every major news site. Both of them caught in that moment of unguarded humanity. Her tear-streaked face, his weary eyes, Ranger sitting between them like a silent witness. Journalists camped outside her small porch in Ashford, their microphones pointed like weapons, but this time the attention didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like vindication. Gary managed their emails and calls, his fingers moving faster than the flood of messages from lawyers, activists, even retired detectives who wanted to help. It's not just a story anymore, Gary said, glancing up from his laptop. It's a reckoning. Hale Industries tried to respond with polished statements and expensive press conferences. Richard Hale appeared on live television, standing beside his lawyer and claiming the allegations were deeply hurtful fabrications. His voice carried the practiced sincerity of a man used to bending truth into sympathy, but the world was no longer listening the same way. People online compared his words to the dashcam footage, the voice ordering to keep driving, and found the dissonance unbearable. Hashtags surged across platforms. Protesters gathered outside Hale's offices holding signs that read, "Justice for Ethan," and "Truth isn't illegal." Within 48 hours, talk shows debated the ethics of evidence in the digital age, and senators demanded a review of the state's handling of corporate-related deaths. The governor's office released a brief statement. In light of new public concern, the Ashford case will be re-examined. For Evelyn, that was the moment her breath caught. Proof that truth could still rise when too many hands had tried to bury it. She turned to James, her voice trembling. "You did this." He shook his head. "No, we all did. People just needed to be reminded that they still have a say." But victory was not clean. Threats arrived in their inboxes. Anonymous calls whispered warnings to stop digging. One night, someone threw a rock through Evelyn's window. Ranger barked furiously, glass scattering across the kitchen floor. James reacted without hesitation, sweeping the house with his flashlight, the old soldier in him snapping awake. He didn't find anyone, just the faint smell of exhaust fading down the street. "He's scared," James muttered. "That's good. It means we're close." The next day, a convoy of reporters followed the local police chief as he announced that the investigation into Ethan Carter's death was being officially reopened. Due to new evidence circulating publicly and concerns of procedural oversight, this office has decided to re-examine all materials related to the incident, he said. Behind him, microphones crackled and camera flashes erupted like lightning. Hale's attorney released another statement hours later, denouncing the reopening as a dangerous precedent allowing mob mentality to influence justice. But the tide had turned, and this time it wasn't stopping. Inside the small living room where it all began, Evelyn sat beside James, watching the newsfeed as agents in uniform collected boxes from Hale Industries. "Do you think they'll really find what we found?" she asked quietly. James exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on the screen. "They'll find more," he said. "People like Hale always leave a trail. Arrogance does that." Gary walked in, holding his phone up. "You two just hit 15 million views," he said. "The clips everywhere, morning shows, late-night news, podcasts, even the networks that used to ignore stories like this are talking." For the first time in months, Evelyn smiled without forcing it. 15 million hearts, she whispered. "Maybe that's what it takes to make a country listen." Ranger lifted his head and rested it gently on her lap, as if agreeing. Outside, car horns and city noise mingled with the hum of a crowd gathering in front of the courthouse, voices rising in unison. When James stepped outside, the air felt different, charged, alive. He could feel the pulse of something bigger than himself, than Evelyn, even than Ethan. A nation that had looked away for too long was finally looking back. He glanced at the horizon, where a television tower blinked red in the distance, and said under his breath, "You can silence a man, but not a truth carried by millions." That night, as they sat together on the porch with cameras flashing beyond the fence and wind rustling through the grass, James felt a rare quiet in his chest. Evelyn leaned against him, Ranger curled by their feet. "You think it's over?" she asked softly. James shook his head. "No," he said, his gaze steady. "It's just the first time we're being heard." The courthouse was silent, the kind of silence that hums with waiting hearts. Outside, the square was filled with people holding candles, their small flames swaying against the gray morning light. The air was heavy with hope and fear, two emotions that often share the same breath. James stood near the front beside Evelyn, his posture straight, his jaw set, but his eyes, those carried the weight of everything they'd fought for. Ranger sat obediently at his feet, tail curled, gaze steady on the doors where truth was about to be spoken aloud. Inside, Richard Hale sat at the defense table, the perfect image of composure. Yet beneath that polished surface lay the cracks of a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. The trial had stretched for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of lies. Experts verified the dashcam footage. No manipulation, no edits, only the unfiltered echo of that terrible night. Then came the witnesses, the security guard who had been silent out of fear, the mechanic's widow who found hidden payments in her husband's account, and finally, the internal accountant from Hale Industries, who confessed to altering maintenance reports under direct order. Each testimony was another stone laid upon the foundation of justice Ethan Carter had been denied. The courtroom had grown quieter with every word, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When the prosecution rested its case, Hale's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, rose for his final argument, his voice smooth as silk, dripping with the confidence of a man who believed money could rewrite truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the jury, "this is not about guilt, but about grief. My client has been made into a villain because tragedy demands one. Do not confuse sympathy with evidence." His words were precise but hollow. He didn't realize the world outside had already decided what truth looked like. James watched from the gallery, his hand brushing against the old dog tags in his pocket, a habit he'd picked up from the battlefield whenever he needed courage. He wasn't praying for vengeance. He was praying for peace. Beside him, Evelyn held the photograph of Ethan, her thumb tracing his smile. The judge's gavel called for silence, and the jury filed back into their seats. The foreman, a gray-haired woman with eyes that had seen more injustice than comfort, stood. "We find the defendant, Richard Hale, guilty on all counts." Time seemed to fracture into fragments. Evelyn gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. James closed his eyes, a slow exhale escaping him like the release of something he had carried too long. Ranger gave a single low bark, almost as if he understood that the fight they began in silence had found its answer. Hale sat motionless as the judge delivered the sentence, 25 years in federal prison. Around the courtroom, the murmur of restrained emotion swelled into a wave, reporters scribbling, onlookers, whispering, cameras flashing. But through it all, Evelyn remained still, her tears falling onto the photo in her hands. Not tears of despair this time, but of closure. Afterward, when the crowd spilled into the square, the candles still burned, though the sun had begun to rise. The light that once felt fragile now glowed with certainty. Evelyn stood at the courthouse steps, her voice trembling as she